My son mocked me for living in the same house for years. He didn't know I had $12.5 million hidden in gold. But that discovery would change everything. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Edith. I'm 78 years old, and I live in a modest brick house on Maple Street in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, the same house where I've lived for 43 years. The same house where my late husband Robert and I raised our 3 children. The same house that my son Mark calls a dump when he thinks I can't hear him whispering to his wife on the phone. This morning, like every morning for the past 5 years since Robert passed, I woke to the sound of the old radiator clanking to life. The floorboards creaked under my slippered feet as I made my way to the kitchen, my arthritic hands already aching before the day began. I brewed my tea in the same chipped ceramic pot Robert bought me for our 20th anniversary. The steam rose and fogged my reading glasses as I sat by the window, watching the neighbors hurry past with their coffee cups and briefcases. Mrs. Patterson from next door was already tending to her roses. She waved at me through the glass, and I waved back, forcing a smile that felt heavier each day. The morning light filtered through curtains that had seen better decades, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Everything in this house held a memory. The dent in the kitchen table where Mark dropped his toy truck when he was 7, the pencil marks on the doorframe tracking my children's heights, the faint scent of Robert's pipe tobacco that somehow still lingered in the living room, even after all these years. I was stirring honey into my tea when my phone buzzed. A text message from Mark. "Sorry, Mom. Got caught up at work again. Can't make lunch today." My heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water. This was the 3rd time in 2 months he'd canceled our monthly lunch. The only time I saw my eldest son anymore was when he needed something. I stared at that message for a long time, my tea growing cold in my hands. Through the window, I watched a young mother pushing her toddler on a swing at the small park across the street. Her laughter carried on the autumn breeze, and for a moment, I remembered pushing Mark on that very same swing 35 years ago. His chubby hands gripping the chains, his delighted squeals echoing through the neighborhood. Where did that little boy go? When did he become this distant stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obligation? I picked up the framed photo on my kitchen table. Mark at age 8, missing his 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera with chocolate cake smeared on his chin. It was his birthday that year, and Robert had surprised him with a bicycle, red with white streamers on the handlebars. Mark had hugged me so tight that day, whispering, "Thank you, Mommy," in my ear. I traced his face in the photo with my finger, feeling the cold glass under my touch. The house felt enormous and empty around me. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a basement, an attic, and a small garden that Robert had planted with such care. Too much space for one old woman, everyone said. "Why don't you downsize, Mom?" Lisa, my youngest, would suggest during her brief phone calls. "You could get a nice little apartment closer to us." But they didn't understand. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of everything I held dear. I walked slowly to the living room, my joints protesting with each step. The hardwood floors groaned under my weight, a symphony of age that matched my own creaking bones. I settled into Robert's favorite armchair, the brown leather worn smooth by decades of use. From here, I could see the entire first floor of our home, the china cabinet filled with wedding gifts we'd never used, the bookshelf lined with volumes Robert collected but never had time to read, the piano where Lisa had practiced scales every afternoon after school, the keys now silent and dusty. This was my life now. This quiet routine of solitude punctuated by brief, disappointing encounters with my children. But it hadn't always been this way. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to when we first bought this house in 1980. I was 35 then, Robert was 37, and we had 3 young children under the age of 10. Mark was 9, my middle child David was 6, and Lisa was barely 4. Robert had just gotten promoted at the steel plant, and we scraped together every penny we had for the down payment on this place. I remember the first night we slept here. The children were so excited they could barely contain themselves. Mark claimed the largest bedroom, David took the one facing the backyard so he could watch for birds, and Lisa insisted on the room with the pink wallpaper that the previous owners had left behind. Robert and I collapsed into bed that night, exhausted but happy, knowing we had given our children a real home. Those early years were hard, but they were beautiful. Money was always tight. Robert worked long hours at the plant, and I took night shifts at Chicago General Hospital to make ends meet. I was a registered nurse, and the work was demanding, but I loved caring for people. I understood pain, both physical and emotional, and I had gentle hands that could comfort the frightened and the hurting. But being a working mother in the 80s was like running a marathon every single day. I would finish my shift at the hospital at 7 in the morning, rush home to get the children ready for school, maybe catch an hour of sleep if I was lucky, then be back up to help with homework, make dinner, and prepare for another night shift. My feet ached constantly. My back throbbed from lifting patients and bending over hospital beds. But when Mark brought home an A on his math test, or when David scored a goal in soccer, or when Lisa's teacher said she was the most well-behaved child in class, every sacrifice felt worth it. Robert was a good man, a devoted father, but he came from a generation where certain expectations existed. He worked. I managed everything else: the household, the children's schedules, the grocery shopping, the doctor's appointments, the parent-teacher conferences, the birthday parties, the scraped knees, the teenage heartbreaks. I was the emotional center of our family, the one everyone turned to when they needed comfort or solutions. And through it all, I saved every penny I could, not just for us, but for the children's futures. I clipped coupons, shopped sales, mended clothes instead of buying new ones, grew vegetables in our small backyard garden. Every dollar I managed to set aside went into envelopes hidden in my bedroom drawer, labeled for different purposes: Mark's college, David's college, Lisa's college, emergency fund, vacation someday. Robert knew about some of my savings, but not all of it. He was a wonderful man, but he had a tendency to spend money when he had it. A new tool for the garage, a round of drinks for his coworkers after a hard week, a gift for me that we couldn't really afford, but that made him feel generous. I loved his big heart, but I also knew that if we were going to secure our family's future, I needed to be the one holding the purse strings. The years passed in a blur of soccer games and school plays, first dates and graduation ceremonies. Mark grew into a confident young man with his father's strong jaw and my determined spirit. He was smart, quick with numbers, always talking about business ideas and ways to make money. David developed into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved nature and wanted to be a park ranger. Lisa was my little social butterfly, popular in school, always bringing friends home for dinner. When Mark turned 17, he came to me with big dreams about college. He wanted to study business at Northwestern University, one of the most expensive schools in the country. The tuition alone was more than Robert made in a year. But when I saw the light in my son's eyes as he talked about his plans, I knew I would find a way to make it happen. I had been secretly investing small amounts of money over the years. Nothing dramatic, nothing that Robert would notice missing from our household budget. But I had put a few dollars here and there into gold coins whenever I could afford it. Gold felt safe to me, more real than stocks or bonds that could disappear with a market crash. I could hold gold in my hands, feel its weight, know it was there. By the time Mark was ready for college, I had accumulated a small but significant collection of gold coins hidden in various places throughout the house. Some were in a safety deposit box at Chicago First National. Others were wrapped in cloth and tucked behind books on our shelves. I had even buried some in waterproof containers in our backyard, beneath Robert's prized rose bushes. When Mark got accepted to Northwestern, I sat him down at our kitchen table and told him not to worry about the money. "How, Mom?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope and disbelief. "We don't have that kind of money." "Let me worry about that," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You just focus on your studies and make us proud." I sold some of my gold to pay for Mark's first year of tuition, not enough to make a noticeable dent in my secret collection, but enough to give my son the education he dreamed of. He never asked where the money came from, and I never told him. It felt good to be able to provide for my child without him having to worry or feel guilty about the cost. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 4 years, Mark's expenses grew beyond tuition. There were textbooks, housing, meal plans, a computer, a car so he could come home on weekends. There were fraternity dues, spring break trips, networking dinners, interview suits. Each time he called with a new financial need, I found a way to cover it. "Mom, I know this is a lot to ask," he would begin, his voice carrying that familiar tone of sheepish request. And each time I would reassure him that everything was fine, that we could manage, that his education was the most important investment we could make. I started working extra shifts at the hospital to replace the money I was spending on Mark. My body protested, but I pushed through the exhaustion. When David started talking about college 2 years later, I realized I would need to be even more creative with my resources. I began selling more gold, small amounts that wouldn't be missed, converting my careful savings into my children's futures. Robert started asking questions around this time. "Edith, how are we managing these college expenses?" he would wonder aloud, looking at our monthly budget. "My salary covers our household bills, but these tuition payments, I've been saving for years," I told him, which was true. "And I'm working more hours," also true. What I didn't tell him was about the extensive collection of gold I had accumulated. or how I was systematically liquidating it to fund our children's educations. David's college years were less expensive. He chose a state school and studied environmental science, living modestly and rarely asking for extra money. But Lisa, when her time came, had expensive tastes. She wanted to study fashion design in New York City. The cost of living alone was staggering, before we even considered tuition at Parsons School of Design. By the time all 3 children had finished college, I had sold nearly half of my gold collection. But seeing them walk across their graduation stages, diploma in hand, filled me with a pride that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Mark graduated summa cum laude with a business degree. David earned his degree in environmental science and got a job with the National Park Service. Lisa graduated with honors and landed an internship at a prestigious fashion house in Manhattan. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought once they were established in their careers, they would be independent, and Robert and I could enjoy our retirement years together. We made plans to travel, to visit national parks, to finally use that good china sitting in our cabinet. But life rarely unfolds according to our plans. Mark struggled to find his footing after college. The job market in the early 2000s was challenging, especially for new graduates with expensive degrees but limited work experience. He moved back home for 6 months, then moved out into an apartment I helped him afford, then back home again when that didn't work out. Each transition came with financial requests that I couldn't refuse. "It's just temporary, Mom," he would promise. "Once I get established, I'll pay you back everything." I always said the same thing. "Don't worry about paying me back. Just focus on building your life." But temporary stretched into months, then years. Mark would find a job, work for a while, then quit or get fired and need help again. There was always a reason, always a circumstance beyond his control. The economy, unfair bosses, office politics, a better opportunity that required startup capital. Meanwhile, David was doing well with the Park Service, but his salary was modest and he lived far away in Colorado. Lisa had gotten married and moved to California, where the cost of living consumed most of her income. Neither of them asked for money regularly, but when they did need help, I provided it without question. Then, 15 years ago, Robert was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. He was only 64, still working, still the vital man I had married nearly 40 years earlier. But the diagnosis changed everything. At first, the symptoms were subtle. He would forget names of coworkers he had known for decades. He would get confused about dates or repeat the same story multiple times in one conversation. I convinced myself it was just normal aging, the kind of forgetfulness we all experience as we get older, but it progressed quickly. Within 2 years, Robert had to retire on disability. Within 3 years, he needed supervision throughout the day. By the 5th year, he no longer recognized our neighbors and sometimes had trouble remembering our children's names. I became his full-time caregiver. I quit my job at the hospital, despite being only 58 years old and nowhere near ready for retirement. But Robert needed me, and there was no question in my mind about what I had to do. He had been my partner, my love, the father of my children, and my best friend for decades. If I couldn't care for him in his time of need, what kind of person would I be? Caring for someone with Alzheimer's is unlike any other challenge I had ever faced. As a nurse, I understood the medical aspects of his condition, but understanding it professionally and living with it personally were vastly different experiences. I watched the man I loved disappear piece by piece, memory by memory, until he became a confused stranger wearing my husband's face. The financial strain was enormous. Robert's disability payments covered some expenses, but the cost of his medications, special foods, safety modifications to our home, and medical equipment mounted quickly. I had to hire help for a few hours each day just so I could run errands or attend to other necessities. Once again, I turned to my gold. I sold more coins, more bars, converting my secret savings into medical care for my husband. I never begrudged a single penny spent on Robert's care, but watching my carefully accumulated wealth diminish was heartbreaking. This was money I had saved for our golden years together, for the travels we had planned, for the comfortable retirement we had both worked toward. The children helped when they could. Mark would visit occasionally, though he seemed uncomfortable around his father as the disease progressed. He struggled to relate to this version of Robert, who sometimes didn't recognize him or called him by his brother's name. David flew in from Colorado several times and was always gentle and patient with his father. Lisa visited less frequently but would call regularly to check on us. But the day-to-day reality of caring for Robert fell entirely on my shoulders. I helped him dress, prepared his meals, supervised his medications, guided him through basic hygiene, and stayed awake many nights when he became confused and agitated. Sleep-deprived and emotionally drained, I aged rapidly during those years. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the financial stress. It was the profound loneliness. Robert was still physically present, but the man I had shared my life with was gone. I couldn't discuss my worries with him, couldn't ask his opinion about family matters, couldn't share memories that he no longer possessed. I felt like a widow while still being a wife. Mark was going through his own challenges during this time. He had started and failed at several business ventures, accumulated significant debt, and was going through a messy divorce. His financial requests became more frequent and more substantial. He needed money for lawyers, for rent, for his car payment, for child support when his ex-wife demanded it. "I'm drowning here, Mom," he told me during one of his visits. We were sitting in the living room while Robert napped in his chair nearby. "I know Dad's sick and money is tight, but I don't know where else to turn." I looked at my 40-year-old son, seeing the defeated expression I remembered from his childhood when he couldn't solve a difficult math problem. My heart ached for him even as I felt overwhelmed by my own circumstances. "How much do you need?" I asked. 15,000, he said quietly. "I know it's a lot, but I'll pay you back as soon as I get back on my feet." $15,000. It was more money than I had readily available without selling more gold. But looking at Mark's desperate face, I knew I would find a way. I always found a way. That evening, after Robert was asleep, I went down to our basement and opened one of my hidden safes. I counted out gold coins worth approximately $15,000 and made plans to visit the coin dealer the next day. As I held those coins, I felt their familiar weight and wondered how many more times I would need to do this. Robert's condition deteriorated rapidly over the final 2 years of his life. He became bedridden, requiring around-the-clock care. I hired a part-time aide, but even with help, I was exhausted beyond measure. I lost 20 pounds, developed chronic back pain from lifting and turning him, and hadn't slept more than 3 consecutive hours in months. The children visited more frequently during this period, perhaps sensing that the end was approaching. Mark would sit by his father's bedside and talk about his childhood memories, even though Robert rarely responded. David brought photo albums and would show his father pictures from family camping trips. Lisa would brush Robert's hair and help me with his personal care. When Robert passed away 5 years ago, I felt relief as much as grief. Relief that his suffering was over, relief that he was finally at peace, and if I'm being completely honest, relief that the crushing weight of caregiving was lifted from my shoulders. The guilt about feeling relieved added another layer to my mourning. The funeral was well attended. Robert had been well liked at the steel plant and in our neighborhood. People shared stories about his kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to his family. I sat in the front pew, listening to these tributes to the man I had loved for 43 years, feeling simultaneously proud of the life he had lived and profoundly alone in my grief. After the funeral, the children returned to their own lives, and I began the long process of learning how to live alone. The house felt cavernous without Robert's presence. Years of caring for him had given structure to my days, and suddenly I had nothing but empty hours stretching endlessly ahead. I was 68 years old, a widow with grown children, living alone in a 4-bedroom house filled with memories. My savings account was depleted from years of medical expenses. My energy was depleted from years of caregiving. My social connections had withered from years of being too busy or too tired to maintain friendships. But I still had my gold, hidden throughout the house, buried in the garden, stored in safety deposit boxes around the city. I still had a substantial collection of coins and bars that I had accumulated over decades. It was my secret nest egg, my insurance against disaster, my legacy to leave to my children. I never told them about the extent of my gold holdings. Even Robert hadn't known the full scope of what I had managed to save and invest over the years. It started as small purchases, $5 or $10 worth of gold coins when I could afford them. But over 40 years, with the price of gold fluctuating and generally trending upward, those small investments had grown into something substantial. By the most conservative estimates, I now owned gold worth approximately $12.5 million. I had never counted it precisely. The collection was scattered across multiple locations for safety. Some coins were in bank safety deposit boxes under my name. Others were hidden in the house in places Robert had never thought to look. I had buried gold bars wrapped in waterproof materials beneath various spots in our garden. I had even given some coins to trusted friends to hold, without telling them the true value of what they were safeguarding. The accumulation had been gradual and strategic. Whenever I had extra money from selling my gold for family expenses, I would sometimes use a portion of those funds to buy more gold when prices were low. I had also inherited some coins from my own parents, who had lived through the Great Depression and understood the value of holding tangible assets. But despite having this substantial wealth, I lived modestly. I didn't want to draw attention to my financial situation. I didn't want my children to view me differently or to start making assumptions about their inheritances. Most importantly, I wanted them to succeed on their own merits, to develop work ethics and independence that would serve them throughout their lives. Mark, however, was struggling with independence. At 43, he was still calling me regularly with financial crises that somehow always required my immediate assistance. His latest venture was a technology startup focused on developing apps for small businesses. He was convinced this would be his breakthrough opportunity, the business that would finally establish him as a successful entrepreneur. The market research shows incredible demand, he explained during one of his visits. We were sitting in my kitchen and he had his laptop open, showing me charts and graphs I didn't fully understand. Small business owners are desperate for affordable software solutions. Our app could revolutionize how they manage inventory, process payments, track customers. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar market opportunity. I listened patiently, the same way I had listened to dozens of similar presentations over the years. Mark was intelligent and articulate, and his enthusiasm was genuine, but I had heard variations of this same conversation many times before. It sounds promising, I said. But what do you need from me? 50,000, he said without hesitation. I know it's a significant amount, but this is different from my other projects. I have real partners this time, experienced developers, a solid business plan. We just need enough capital to get through the development phase and initial marketing. $50,000. It was more than he had ever requested at one time. I thought about the gold coins stored in my basement safe, each one representing hours of work at the hospital, sacrifices I had made for my family's future. Let me think about it, I said. Mark's expression tightened slightly. Mom, I need to know soon. The other investors are ready to pull out if I can't contribute my share. This opportunity won't wait. Other investors. This was new information. Who else is investing in your company? Some business associates, a few guys from my networking group. They're putting in significant amounts and they expect the same level of commitment from me. I wondered how much money these other investors actually existed, or if this was another one of Mark's optimistic projections. But looking at my son's hopeful face, I found myself nodding. I'll see what I can do. That weekend, I went to 3 different coin dealers in Chicago, selling gold coins from my collection to raise the $50,000 Mark needed. Each transaction was painful, watching decades of careful saving converted into cash for another of my son's business ventures. But Mark was my child, and despite his track record with money, I couldn't bear the thought of him failing for lack of support from his mother. The pattern continued for the next 3 years. Mark's app development company showed initial promise, but there were always unexpected expenses, always additional capital requirements, always new opportunities that required immediate funding. We're so close to breaking through, became his regular refrain. We just need another $20,000 for marketing. Then, the development costs were higher than projected. Could you help with $30,000? Then, one of our partners dropped out. If I could invest another $40,000, I could buy out his share and own a bigger portion of the company. Each time, I sold more gold. Each time, I told myself this would be the last time. Each time, I convinced myself that Mark was finally mature enough to succeed if given proper support. But success never materialized. The app launched with great fanfare, generated modest initial sales, then gradually faded into obscurity. Mark blamed market conditions, unfair competition, inadequate funding, incompetent partners. The reasons varied, but the outcome was always the same. By the time the business finally closed its doors 2 years ago, I had invested nearly $300,000 in Mark's venture. $300,000 worth of gold coins that had been accumulated over decades of careful saving. I never asked for the money back. Mark never offered to repay it. We both pretended that the investment had been a gift, though neither of us acknowledged this pretense directly. During this same period, David was thriving in his career with the National Park Service. He had been promoted several times and was now managing a large section of Yellowstone National Park. He loved his work, was respected by his colleagues, and had built a comfortable life in Montana. He called me regularly, visited when he could arrange vacation time, and never asked for money. Lisa had also found stability. Her fashion career had evolved into freelance consulting, which allowed her flexibility to raise her 2 young children. Her husband worked in tech and earned a good salary. They owned a nice home in San Diego, took family vacations, and seemed genuinely happy. Like David, Lisa called frequently and visited occasionally, but rarely needed financial assistance. It puzzled me that Mark, who had received the most expensive education and the most financial support from me, was the least successful of my 3 children. But as his mother, I felt responsible for his struggles. Perhaps I had made his life too easy. Perhaps I had shielded him from consequences he needed to experience. Perhaps my willingness to solve his financial problems had prevented him from developing the skills necessary to solve them himself. These thoughts plagued me, especially during the long, quiet evenings alone in my house. I would sit in Robert's chair, looking around at our home, wondering if I had failed as a mother. Had my desire to help my son actually harmed him? Had my secret wealth become a crutch that prevented him from learning to walk independently? But then Mark would call, his voice stressed and urgent, describing some new crisis that required immediate attention, and my motherly instincts would override my rational concerns. He was my child. He needed help. I had the means to provide that help. How could I refuse? The requests evolved over time. Instead of business investments, Mark started asking for help with personal expenses. His rent when he was between jobs, car repairs when his vehicle broke down, medical bills when he didn't have insurance, loan payments when he fell behind. Each request was accompanied by explanations that made his needs seem reasonable and temporary. Each request was followed by promises that this would be the last time, that he was getting back on his feet, that independence was just around the corner. And each time, I found myself walking down to my basement, opening one of my safes, and counting out gold coins to be converted into cash for my 46-year-old son. Last year, the dynamic between us began to shift in ways that troubled me deeply. Instead of approaching me with humility and gratitude when he needed help, Mark started displaying entitlement and impatience. "Why do you live in this old house?" he asked during a visit last spring. We were sitting on my back porch, watching birds at the feeder Robert had installed decades earlier. "You could downsize to a nice apartment, maybe in one of those senior communities. The equity from selling this place could keep you comfortable for years?" I looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. "This is my home, Mark. This is where I raised you and your siblings. This is where your father and I built our life together. But it's just you now," he pressed. "It's too much house for one person. And frankly, Mom, it's starting to show its age. The kitchen appliances are from the 80s. The bathroom fixtures need updating. The roof probably needs work soon." His words stung more than he realized. This house might be old, but it was clean, comfortable, and filled with love. Every room held precious memories. Every corner told the story of our family's life together. "I'm not ready to leave," I said quietly. Mark sighed in the way he used to when he was a teenager, and I wouldn't let him do something he wanted. "I'm just saying, Mom, you could have a much nicer lifestyle if you made some practical decisions about your living situation. A much nicer lifestyle." As if my current life was somehow inadequate or embarrassing. As if the home where I had been happy for over 4 decades was beneath acceptable standards. "I'm content with my lifestyle," I replied, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. But Mark wasn't finished. "And you never go anywhere or do anything. When's the last time you took a vacation? When's the last time you went out to dinner somewhere nice? You could be enjoying your retirement instead of just existing. Just existing." That phrase haunted me for days afterward. Was that how my son saw me? As someone who was merely existing rather than living? Someone whose life had become so small and meaningless that it warranted criticism and correction? I thought about the activities that brought me joy. Tending my garden, where I grew tomatoes and herbs and flowers that bloomed each summer. Reading books borrowed from the local library. Often mystery novels that transported me to other worlds. Cooking meals for myself that reminded me of dishes Robert had enjoyed. Watching old movies on Sunday afternoons. Calling my neighbor Mrs. Ramirez to share gossip and garden tips. These activities might seem mundane to Mark, but they gave structure and pleasure to my days. After years of working demanding jobs and caring for a husband with dementia, I found peace in simple routines and quiet moments. But apparently, my son viewed this peaceful retirement as a failure of imagination or ambition. The criticism escalated during subsequent visits. Mark would walk through my house with an appraising eye, commenting on outdated decorations, old furniture, worn carpets. He suggested I hire a housekeeper, update my wardrobe, buy a newer car, install modern technology. "You could get a smartphone, Mom. Then we could text more easily and you could see photos of the family on social media. You could subscribe to streaming services. There are thousands of movies and shows available now. You could join one of those meal delivery services, then you wouldn't have to shop and cook all the time." Each suggestion felt like criticism of my current choices. Each recommendation implied that my life was somehow lacking or insufficient. I began to feel defensive about things that had never bothered me before. The breaking point came 3 months ago, during what I had hoped would be a pleasant Sunday lunch together. I had prepared Mark's favorite meal from childhood, pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. I set the table with my good china, lit candles, and looked forward to a relaxed afternoon with my son. But Mark seemed distracted and impatient from the moment he arrived. He checked his phone constantly during our meal, responded to text messages while I was talking, and seemed anxious to leave. "This is delicious, Mom," he said, but his tone was perfunctory, as if he was fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying a meal I had spent hours preparing. After dessert, as I was clearing the dishes, Mark stood in my kitchen looking around with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom," he said suddenly, "how can you live in this dump for so long? No friends, no trips, just the same old peeling wallpaper and memory." His words hit me like a physical blow. This dump, my home, my sanctuary, the place where I had been happy and sad, where I had celebrated birthdays and mourned losses, where I had raised 3 children and cared for a dying husband. To him it was just a dump. I stood at the sink with my back to him, holding a plate in my trembling hands, trying not to cry. The casual cruelty of his comment took my breath away. How could my own son speak to me with such dismissive contempt? "I mean, seriously," Mark continued, apparently unaware of the impact of his words. "You're 78 years old. You should be living your best life, not hiding away in this old house like some kind of hermit." I turned to face him, and something in my expression must have registered because his confident tone faltered slightly. "This is my home," I said quietly. "This is where I choose to live." Mark shrugged. "I'm just saying you could do better." After he left that afternoon, I sat in my living room and cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral. Not just from hurt feelings, but from a deep sense of betrayal. This was my son, the child I had sacrificed everything to educate and support. This was the boy I had pushed on swings in the park, helped with homework, cheered at baseball games, held when he was sick, encouraged when he was discouraged, and he saw me as pathetic. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house in the darkness, touching familiar objects, remembering the stories they held. The wedding photo on the mantelpiece, where Robert and I looked impossibly young and hopeful. The handprint Lisa had made in clay during kindergarten art class. The school awards Mark had won, still hanging in frames on the hallway wall. How had I become someone to be pitied and criticized? When had my son stopped seeing me as a person deserving of respect and started viewing me as a burden or an embarrassment? I thought about the money I had given him over the years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars converted from my secret gold collection to fund his education, his business ventures, his personal expenses. Money I had earned through decades of hard work, saved through countless small sacrifices, invested carefully to grow over time. Had that money bought his contempt rather than his gratitude? The next morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. When Mark called with another financial request, this time for help with rent after his latest job had ended unexpectedly, I said something I had never said before. "No." The word hung in the silence between us. "No?" Mark repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "I can't help you this time," I said, my heart pounding. "But Mom, I'm about to be evicted. I need $1,500 just until I can find another job. You know I'm good for it. Good for it." In all the years I had been helping him financially, Mark had never repaid a single dollar. The phrase would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. "I'm sorry, but no." "Are you serious right now?" His tone shifted from pleading to indignant. "Mom, this is an emergency. I'm your son." "Yes, you are my son," I thought. "And yesterday you called my home a dump and implied that I was wasting my life. You are my son, who has never asked about my well-being, never inquired about my finances, never wondered if I might need help myself." But I didn't say any of that. I simply repeated, "I can't help you this time." Mark hung up on me. For 3 days I heard nothing from him. No calls, no texts, no drop-by visits. I told myself this was what I had wanted. Independence from the constant financial requests. Freedom from being viewed as nothing more than a source of emergency funding. But the silence hurt more than I had expected. Despite everything, Mark was still my child. And I missed the sound of his voice, even when that voice was asking me for money. On the 4th day, he called back. "I'm sorry I hung up on you," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. "I was stressed about my situation, but I found a temporary solution for the rent, so don't worry about it." I wanted to ask what kind of temporary solution, but I didn't. I was afraid the answer would be another loan from someone else, another financial arrangement that would eventually require my assistance to resolve. Instead, I said, "I'm glad you worked things out." "Yeah, well, I had to take care of it myself since—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. "Since you let me down, since you failed to help when I needed you." That conversation planted a seed of doubt that grew larger over the following weeks. Had I made the right decision in refusing to help? Was I being selfish with resources that could solve my son's immediate problem? Was this tough love, or was it simply meanness? I found myself second-guessing every interaction we had. When Mark visited, I analyzed his words and expressions for signs of resentment or forgiveness. When he didn't visit, I wondered if he was angry or simply busy with his own life. The uncertainty was exhausting. For decades, our relationship had followed a predictable pattern. Mark would encounter a financial crisis, ask for help, receive help, express gratitude, and disappear until the next crisis arose. The pattern was dysfunctional, but it was familiar. Now I didn't know what to expect from him or how to behave toward him. 2 months after I had refused his request for rent money, Mark surprised me with an unexpected visit on a Saturday afternoon. He seemed to be in good spirits, chatting about his latest job prospects and asking about my garden and my health. As we sat on my back porch drinking iced tea, I allowed myself to hope that we had moved past the awkwardness of our recent interactions. Perhaps my refusal to give him money had actually helped him develop more independence. Perhaps he was finally growing into the self-sufficient adult I had always wanted him to become. Then he mentioned, almost casually, that he had been talking with Lisa and David about my living situation. "We're all a little concerned about you living alone in such a big house," he said. "Maybe it's time to consider some alternatives." My blood ran cold. He had been discussing me with his siblings, making plans for my future without consulting me. What kind of alternatives? Well, there are some really nice retirement communities in the area, places where you could have your own apartment, but also access to activities, meal services, medical care if you need it. You could make friends with people your own age, people my own age. As if I was too old to function independently, too decrepit to manage my own household, too isolated to make appropriate decisions about my life. "I don't want to live in a retirement community," I said firmly. "But Mom, you might like it more than you think, and it would be so much safer. What if you fell and couldn't get help? What if you had a medical emergency? What if someone broke into your house?" These were legitimate concerns, but hearing them from Mark felt more like manipulation than genuine worry, especially since none of my children had shown much interest in my day-to-day well-being until now, when my living situation had become something they wanted to change. "I have neighbors who check on me," I said. "I have a medical alert bracelet. I keep my doors locked. I'm not helpless." "No one said you were helpless," Mark replied, but his tone suggested otherwise. "We just want what's best for you. We." He kept using that pronoun, implying that my children had reached a consensus about my future. I wondered how many family conversations had taken place without my knowledge, how many decisions had been made about my life without my input. "What's best for me is staying in my own home," I said. Mark sighed his familiar teenage sigh. "Mom, be realistic. This house is too much for you to maintain. The property taxes alone must be eating up a big chunk of your Social Security. And if something major needs repair, like the roof or the furnace, how are you going to afford it?" How was I going to afford it? If only he knew about the gold hidden throughout this house, the coins buried in the garden, the bars stored in safety deposit boxes around the city. If only he knew that I could afford to replace the roof, the furnace, and every other system in this house without making a dent in my assets. But he didn't know, because I had never told him. And in that moment, I realized why I had kept my wealth secret for so many years. Not just to protect the money itself, but to protect myself from being viewed differently by my children. If Mark knew about my gold collection, would he see me as a person or as an asset to be managed? Would he respect my decisions about my life, or would he feel entitled to make decisions for me based on what he perceived as my best interests? Looking at my son's confident expression, his casual assumption that he knew what was best for me better than I knew myself, I suspected the answer. That night, after Mark left, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through my house and took inventory of my hidden gold collection. I opened the safe in my basement, where dozens of coins glowed in the dim light. I went to my bedroom and found the coins tucked behind books, wrapped in cloth, stored in old jewelry boxes. I even went outside with a flashlight and checked the waterproof containers buried beneath Robert's rose bushes. For the first time in decades, I tried to calculate the total value of my holdings. Gold prices had fluctuated over the years, but they had generally trended upward. Coins I had purchased for $50 or $60 were now worth several hundred. Bars I had bought for a few $1,000s had increased substantially in value. By the most conservative estimates, accounting for current market prices, I owned approximately $12.5 million worth of gold. $12.5 million. I sat in my living room at midnight, surrounded by small stacks of coins I had retrieved from their hiding places, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what I had accumulated over 40 years of careful saving and investing. I was not the financially struggling widow my children imagined me to be. I was not dependent on Social Security and worried about affording home repairs. I was not in need of their guidance about downsizing or moving to more affordable housing. I was, by any reasonable measure, wealthy. But I was also profoundly lonely. My wealth had been secret for so long that it had become a barrier between me and my children rather than a bridge. They saw me as someone to be pitied and managed rather than respected and consulted. And perhaps most painful of all, I realized that their perception of me was partly my own creation. By never revealing my financial security, by continuing to live modestly, by allowing them to believe I needed their guidance and support, I had enabled them to treat me as less capable than I actually was. The next few weeks passed in a haze of reflection and regret. I went through my normal routines, gardening, reading, cooking, cleaning, but my mind was preoccupied with questions I had never seriously considered before. What was the point of having wealth if it remained hidden and unused? What was the purpose of financial security if it couldn't protect me from being dismissed and disrespected by my own children? Why had I worked so hard to save money that I was too afraid to acknowledge? I thought about Robert and wondered what he would have said about my secret collection. He had known about some of my gold purchases, but not the extent of them. Would he have approved of my secrecy? Or would he have encouraged me to be more open about our family's financial position? I thought about my nursing colleagues from years past, women who had worked just as hard as I had but hadn't been as fortunate in their investments or as careful with their savings. Many of them were now struggling financially, worried about medical expenses and housing costs in their retirement years. I thought about my neighbors, some of whom I knew were having difficulty making ends meet on fixed incomes. Mrs. Patterson next door had mentioned that her prescription costs were getting harder to manage. Mr. Chen from down the street had been doing his own roof repairs because he couldn't afford to hire professionals. Meanwhile, I was sitting on millions of dollars worth of assets and living as if I was barely scraping by. The contradiction felt increasingly absurd and unsustainable. But the thought of revealing my wealth also terrified me. How would my children react? Would they be angry that I had hidden my financial position for so long? Would they feel entitled to immediate access to their inheritance? Would they start treating me like a bank rather than a mother? These fears had kept me silent for decades, but silence was no longer serving me well. My children already treated me like someone whose opinions didn't matter and whose choices needed correction. How could honest communication about my finances make our relationships worse than they already were? The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Ramirez, my neighbor from 2 doors down, stopped by one afternoon with a plate of homemade tamales. We sat on my front porch, sharing food and conversation as we had done many times before. Elena Ramirez was 74 years old, a widow like myself, and one of the most vibrant people I knew. She volunteered at a local community center, traveled regularly to visit her grandchildren in Texas, and somehow managed to maintain friendships with people half her age. "You seem troubled lately, Edith," she observed as we watched children playing in the park across the street. "Is everything all right?" I found myself telling Elena about my recent interactions with Mark, about his suggestions that I downsize my living situation, about his dismissive comments regarding my lifestyle choices. Elena listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions that helped me articulate feelings I had been struggling to express. "It sounds like your son doesn't see you clearly," she said finally. "He sees his idea of who you are rather than who you actually are." Her words struck me with unexpected force. That was exactly the problem. Mark, and perhaps my other children as well, had created a version of me in their minds that didn't match my reality. They saw a financially struggling elderly woman who needed guidance and protection. They didn't see the person I actually was, someone who had been making independent decisions about money and life for decades, someone who had accumulated substantial wealth through careful planning and hard work, someone who was capable of managing her own affairs without external intervention. But how do I show him who I really am without— I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to Elena about my financial situation. Without what? Without changing the way he sees me in ways I might not want. I finished lamely. Elena smiled. "Edith, do you really think he could see you in a worse light than he already does?" Her question cut to the heart of my dilemma. Mark already viewed me as someone whose life was small and sad, whose choices were questionable, whose opinions were inconsequential. How could honesty about my circumstances make his opinion of me any lower? And more importantly, why was I so concerned about maintaining his good opinion when he had shown so little concern about maintaining mine? That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to tell my children the truth about my financial situation. Not necessarily the full extent of my wealth. That revelation could wait until I was ready for it. But enough truth to correct their misperceptions and assert my right to be treated with respect. I started with David, calling him at his home in Montana. He was always the most level-headed of my children, the most likely to listen without judgment. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "How are you doing?" "I'm well," I said, "but I wanted to talk to you about something important." I explained that Mark had been pressuring me to sell my house and move to a retirement community, and that he had been discussing my living situation with his siblings without including me in those conversations. David was quiet for a moment. "Mom, are you having trouble managing the house? Because if you need help with maintenance or expenses, that's just it," I interrupted. "I don't need help. I'm financially secure, more secure than you might realize. I can afford to maintain my house and I want to continue living here." "Okay," David said slowly. "If you're comfortable with your situation, then that's what matters. But Mom, Mark mentioned that you seemed isolated, that you don't do much outside the house." I felt a familiar surge of frustration. I do plenty of things that bring me joy. I garden, I read, I spend time with neighbors, I volunteer at the library. My life may look quiet from the outside, but it's full of activities I enjoy. I understand. I guess we just worry about you being alone so much. I appreciate your concern, but I need you to trust that I know what's best for myself. I've been making independent decisions for 78 years. I don't need my children to start making them for me now. David was quiet again. "You're absolutely right, Mom. I'm sorry if we've been overstepping." His apology was immediate and sincere, which was so different from the defensive responses I had come to expect from Mark. It reminded me why David had always been easy to talk to, even as a child. "I just want you all to respect that this is my life and my choice," I said. "I love you all, but I need you to see me as a capable adult rather than a problem to be solved." "I do see you that way," David assured me, "and I'll make sure Lisa understands your position too." My conversation with Lisa the following day went similarly well. She was initially concerned about my isolation, but accepted my explanations about my lifestyle choices without argument. She also apologized for discussing my living situation without including me in the conversation. "We weren't trying to gang up on you, Mom," she said. "We just want to make sure you're happy and safe." "I am happy," I told her, "and I'm safer than you might think." Both David and Lisa promised to support my decision to remain in my house and to discourage Mark from continuing to pressure me about moving. But I knew that Mark himself would require a different approach. He had invested too much energy in his vision of my life to abandon it based on a simple phone conversation. He would need more concrete evidence that his concerns were unfounded. I decided to invite him over for Sunday dinner and have a frank conversation about boundaries and respect. If he was genuinely worried about my welfare, I could address those worries directly. If he was simply trying to control my lifestyle choices, I could make it clear that such control was unacceptable. I spent that Saturday preparing Mark's favorite meal, the same pot roast dinner I had made the last time he visited. But this time, I had a different purpose. Instead of hoping for a pleasant family meal, I was preparing for a difficult but necessary confrontation. Mark arrived on time, which surprised me. He seemed to be in a better mood than usual, chatting about a new job prospect and asking about my week. I allowed the conversation to flow naturally through dinner, waiting for the right moment to address more serious topics. After we finished eating, as I was serving coffee and leftover apple pie, Mark brought up the subject I had been expecting. "Have you given any more thought to what we discussed about your living situation?" he asked casually. "I have," I said, "and I've also spoken to David and Lisa about it." Mark's expression became guarded. "Oh? They both understand and respect my decision to continue living in my own home," I said. "I hope you can do the same." "Mom, I just think you're not seeing the big picture here. This house is becoming a burden for you, whether you realize it or not." "In what way is it a burden? The maintenance, the expenses, the isolation? You're limiting your options by staying here." "I'm choosing my options by staying here," I corrected. "There's a difference." Mark set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "Look, I know you think you can handle everything on your own, but what happens when you can't? What happens when you fall down the stairs or have a heart attack and nobody finds you for days? What happens when the roof needs replacing and you can't afford it?" "Those are valid concerns," I acknowledged. "But they're my concerns to address, not yours to solve for me. But as your son, as my son, your role is to support my decisions, not to make decisions for me." Mark sat back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this." Stubborn. Another dismissive word that reduced my autonomous choices to irrational resistance. "I'm not being stubborn," I said quietly. "I'm being independent. There's a difference. Independence is great, Mom, but you have to be realistic about your limitations." "What limitations are those?" "Your age, your income, your social isolation." "Mark," I interrupted, "what do you actually know about my income?" He looked surprised by the question. "I know you live on Social Security and whatever Dad's pension left you. I know money is tight, which is why it doesn't make sense to maintain such an expensive house. What if I told you that money isn't tight? What if I told you that I can comfortably afford to maintain this house for the rest of my life? Mark laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Come on, Mom. You've been asking me to help with expenses for years. I stared at him, confused. I've never asked you for money. Not directly, maybe, but you've made it clear that things were difficult financially. When Dad was sick? When you needed repairs on the house? I tried to remember any conversation where I had indicated financial distress to Mark. I couldn't think of a single instance. If anything, I had been careful to downplay any concerns about money, partly to maintain my secret about the gold, and partly to avoid becoming a burden to my children. I have never asked you for financial help, I repeated. Not once. But I've implied nothing. You've assumed. We stared at each other across my kitchen table, and I could see Mark processing this information. He had constructed a narrative about my life that included financial struggle, and he was reluctant to abandon that narrative even when presented with evidence that it was incorrect. So you're saying you're financially secure? He asked skeptically. I'm saying I'm more secure than you apparently believe. How secure? This was the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. How much truth was I prepared to reveal? Secure enough to live comfortably in my own home for the rest of my life, I said carefully. Secure enough that I don't need my children worrying about my basic needs. Secure enough that I can make my own decisions about my lifestyle without external pressure. Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if looking for signs of deception or delusion. If that's true, he said finally, then why have you been living so modestly? Why don't you travel or update your house or... Because I choose to live this way, I said. Because I find satisfaction in simple pleasures. Because I don't need expensive things to be happy. But you could afford them? I could afford many things. That doesn't mean I want them. Another long silence. I could almost see the wheels turning in Mark's mind as he tried to reconcile this new information with his existing assumptions about my life. Mom, are you telling me that all these years when I've been offering to help, you've been offering to help someone who doesn't need help? I finished gently. The expression on Mark's face went through several changes. Confusion, embarrassment, something that might have been relief, but then it settled into something I hadn't expected. Anger. So why didn't you tell me this before? He demanded. Why did you let me worry about you? Why did you let me feel guilty about not doing enough to support you? His reaction caught me off guard. Instead of being relieved that his financial concerns about me were unfounded, he seemed upset that those concerns had existed in the first place. I never asked you to worry about me, I said. I never asked you to feel guilty. Those were feelings you experienced on your own. Because I'm your son. Because I care about you. Because I thought you needed help. And when you thought I needed help, how did you respond? Mark opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. We both knew how he had responded to his perception of my need, not with offers of assistance or emotional support, but with criticism of my choices and pressure to change my lifestyle to match his vision of what was appropriate. Sitting there in my kitchen, looking at my son's angry and confused face, I realized something important. Mark's concern about my welfare had never been about my actual welfare. It had been about his discomfort with having a mother whose life didn't meet his standards of success and happiness. He wasn't worried that I couldn't afford to maintain my house. He was embarrassed that I chose to live in an older house instead of something more modern and impressive. He wasn't concerned about my social isolation. He was uncomfortable with having a mother who preferred quiet activities over the kind of active lifestyle he thought I should want. He wasn't trying to protect me from financial hardship. He was trying to protect himself from the guilt and embarrassment of having a mother whose life looked, from his perspective, small and sad. Mark, I said quietly, I think you need to examine why my contentment with my life bothers you so much. It doesn't bother me, he said quickly. I just want what's best for you. What's best for me is being treated with respect by my own son. What's best for me is having my choices honored rather than criticized. What's best for me is being seen as a capable adult rather than a problem to be managed. Mark pushed back from the table and stood up. I can't believe you've been lying to me about your finances. I haven't been lying. I've been private. There's a difference. It's the same thing. No, it's not. Lying would be telling you I was broke when I wasn't. Being private is simply not discussing my personal finances with you, which is my right. I'm your son, and I'm your mother, not your financial dependent. I don't owe you detailed information about my assets or income any more than you owe me detailed information about yours. Mark stared at me for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't fully read. Finally, he shook his head. I need some time to process this, he said. Take all the time you need, I replied. But while you're processing, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about whether your concern for me has been about my happiness or about your comfort with my choices. After Mark left that afternoon, I felt simultaneously drained and energized. Drained from the emotional intensity of our conversation, but energized by the sensation of finally speaking my truth aloud. For the first time in years, I had asserted my right to be respected and my authority over my own life. I had challenged Mark's assumptions and made it clear that his approval was not required for my lifestyle choices. But I also knew that our conversation had probably created more problems than it had solved. Mark was angry and confused, and those feelings would likely affect our relationship for some time to come. Over the next few weeks, I heard nothing from Mark. No phone calls, no text messages, no surprise visits. The silence was both relief and punishment. Relief from his criticism and pressure, but punishment in the form of complete withdrawal from my life. David called to check on me, having heard from Mark that we had some kind of argument about my living situation. He seemed pretty shaken up, David told me. He said you told him you were wealthy but had been hiding it from all of us. That's not exactly what I said, I replied. But it's not entirely inaccurate either. Mom, are you wealthy? The direct question from my most straightforward son deserved a direct answer. Wealthier than you might expect, I said carefully. Certainly secure enough to live comfortably without needing guidance or assistance from my children. Why didn't you ever tell us? Because I've seen what money does to families, I said. I've seen children who start viewing their parents as assets rather than people. I've seen siblings fight over inheritances before their parents are even gone. I wanted you all to build your own lives and succeed on your own merits rather than spend your energy thinking about what you might eventually inherit from me. David was quiet for a moment. That makes sense, he said finally. But it must have been hard, keeping that secret for so long. It was, I admitted, but I thought it was necessary. Do you still think it's necessary? I'm not sure. The secret was supposed to protect my relationship with you kids, but it ended up creating different problems. Mark has been treating me like I'm helpless and making decisions about what's best for my life. That needed to stop, even if it meant revealing some information I had planned to keep private. Well, for what it's worth, I think you have the right to live however makes you happy. And I think Mark will come around once he processes everything. I hoped David was right, but I wasn't optimistic. Mark had invested a lot of energy in his vision of me as someone who needed his guidance and correction. Learning that his vision was based on incomplete information would require him to reassess not just his understanding of my situation, but his role in my life. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Mark called. I've been thinking about our conversation, he said without preamble, and I owe you an apology. I was so surprised by his words that I couldn't immediately respond. I was out of line, questioning your choices and pressuring you to change your lifestyle, he continued. You're right that you're an adult and you get to make your own decisions. Thank you, I said quietly. I appreciate that, but I still don't understand why you kept your financial situation secret. Don't you think we had a right to know? And there it was. The word that revealed Mark still didn't fully grasp the point of our earlier conversation. Right. He believed he had a right to information about my personal finances. No, I said firmly. I don't think you had a right to know. I think you might have benefited from knowing, and I might have benefited from telling you. But rights had nothing to do with it. But we're family. Being family doesn't eliminate personal boundaries. Being family doesn't mean everyone gets to know everyone else's private business. Mark was quiet for a moment. So how wealthy are you exactly? His question confirmed my fears about revealing my financial situation. Instead of focusing on the boundary and respect issues that had prompted our original confrontation, he was now focused on the extent of my assets. I'm comfortable, I said. That's all you need to know. But Mom… No, I interrupted. We're not going to have detailed discussions about my finances. That's private information, and I'm not obligated to share it with anyone, including my children. That seems unfair. What's unfair is spending years having my lifestyle choices criticized by someone who didn't have accurate information about my circumstances. What's unfair is being treated like I'm incapable of managing my own affairs. What's unfair is having my own son call my home a dump and suggest that my life is pathetic. I never said your life was pathetic. You said I was just existing rather than living. You said I had no friends and no trips and nothing but old wallpaper and memories. How is that different from calling my life pathetic? Another silence. I could hear Mark breathing on the other end of the line, and I wondered if he was remembering his exact words from that Sunday afternoon when everything changed. I was trying to help, he said finally. I know you thought you were helping, but from my perspective, you were being critical and dismissive. Whether you call my life pathetic or just suggest that it needs improvement, the message I receive is the same, that you don't respect the choices I've made or the way I've chosen to live. So what do you want from me? I want you to see me as a person rather than a project. I want you to respect my autonomy even when you don't understand my choices. I want you to trust that I know myself better than you know me. And if I can do that, will you tell me more about your financial situation? I almost laughed at the transparent negotiation in his question. My willingness to share information with you will depend on whether I trust you to use that information respectfully, I said. Right now, I'm not sure I have that trust. What would it take to rebuild that trust? It was a fair question, and one I needed to think about carefully. Time, I said finally. Show me over time that you can interact with me without criticism, without trying to manage my life, without treating me like I'm incompetent. Show me that you can respect my boundaries and my decisions even when they're different from what you would choose for yourself. How long? I don't know. As long as it takes. We ended the conversation on that uncertain note. Mark seemed to understand that rebuilding our relationship would require sustained effort rather than a single apology, but I wasn't sure he fully grasped what that effort would entail. Over the next few months, Mark made what I could see were genuine attempts to change his behavior. He visited more regularly, but without the critical commentary that had characterized his previous visits. He asked about my activities without suggesting alternatives. He complimented my cooking without adding suggestions for meal delivery services. It was progress, but it felt tentative and performative, as if he was consciously restraining himself rather than genuinely seeing me differently. The real test came in early spring, when I decided to make some changes to my house that I had been considering for years. I hired contractors to update my kitchen with new appliances and countertops. I had the hardwood floors refinished throughout the first floor. I replaced some of the older windows with energy-efficient models. These were not inexpensive projects. The kitchen renovation alone cost more than many people earn in a year, but I had wanted a more functional kitchen for decades, and I finally decided to stop deferring my own comfort in the name of financial caution. When Mark saw the renovations during his next visit, I could see him struggle to process what he was observing. The new kitchen was beautiful. Modern appliances, granite countertops, custom cabinets, and a tile backsplash that reflected light throughout the room. The refinished floors gleamed. The new windows let in more natural light than I had enjoyed in years. "Mom," he said slowly, "these renovations must have cost." "They cost what they cost," I said. "I decided it was time to invest in my comfort and my home's value." "But how could you afford all this?" "The same way anyone affords home improvements. I saved money and spent it on something important to me." Mark walked through my house, taking in all the changes, and I could see him recalculating his understanding of my financial situation. The extent and quality of the renovations clearly indicated access to substantial resources. "Mom, are you rich?" There was that direct question again, the one I had been avoiding for months. I looked at my son, standing in my beautiful new kitchen, and made a decision that surprised even me. "Yes," I said. "I'm rich." The word hung in the air between us like a confession. How rich? Rich enough that I will never need to worry about money. Rich enough that I could afford to live anywhere I wanted, travel anywhere I wanted, buy anything I wanted. Rich enough that your concerns about me being able to afford home maintenance or medical care were completely unnecessary. Mark sat down heavily in one of my kitchen chairs, as if the information was too much to process while standing. "How is that possible? Dad worked at a steel plant. You were a nurse. Those aren't high-paying careers." "You're right, they weren't. But I was careful with money, and I made good investments over many years. Small amounts that grew substantially over time." "What kind of investments?" I hesitated. The gold was still my deepest secret, the one piece of information I wasn't ready to share. "Conservative investments," I said vaguely. "Things that held their value well over decades." Mark stared at me as if I had revealed that I was from another planet. "So when I was asking you for money all those years, you were asking someone who had plenty of money and who gave it to you because I love you and I wanted to help you succeed. But you never told me you could afford it. You never told me it wasn't a hardship. Would it have mattered? Would you have asked for less money if you had known I was wealthy?" Mark considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe. I always felt guilty asking, but I told myself it was okay because I was going to pay you back eventually." "And when were you planning to pay me back?" "When I finally succeeded at something, when one of my businesses took off, or I got a really good job, or when circumstances were different from what they actually were, I guess." We sat in silence in my renovated kitchen, both of us absorbing the implications of this conversation. Mark was learning that his understanding of our family's financial dynamic had been completely incorrect. I was finally acknowledging aloud the secret I had kept for decades. "How much money do you have, Mom?" I had been expecting this question, but I still wasn't prepared to answer it fully. "More than enough," I said. "That's all you need to know right now." "That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I'm ready to give." Mark looked frustrated. but he didn't push the issue. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that information about my finances was a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be demanded. Does Lisa know? Does David know? They know I'm more financially secure than they previously realized. They don't know the details. Are you planning to tell us more eventually? I'm planning to see how you all handle what you know now. What does that mean? It means I've spent decades watching how people behave when they think I have resources they might want or need. Now I get to see how you behave when you know I have those resources. Mark frowned. You don't trust us. I trust you to be human, I said. And humans sometimes behave differently around wealth than they do around perceived financial struggle. That's a pretty cynical view. It's a realistic view. I've seen families torn apart by money. I've seen children who stopped seeing their parents as people and started seeing them as assets to be managed or inheritance to be protected. I've seen siblings turn against each other over financial expectations. I wanted to avoid all of that for as long as possible. But you can't avoid it forever. No, I agreed. Eventually, you'll all know everything. But I get to decide when and how that happens. Mark nodded slowly. I think I understand. And I think I understand why you got so upset when I was criticizing your lifestyle choices. If you're wealthy, then your decision to live modestly is a choice rather than a limitation. Exactly. When you told me I should travel more, or update my house, or move to a nicer place, you were implying that my current choices were the result of financial constraints rather than personal preferences, which was insulting. I confirmed. I'm sorry, Mom. Really sorry. I didn't understand what I was doing. His apology felt more genuine than his earlier attempts, perhaps because he now understood the specific nature of his mistake. I appreciate that, I said. But apologies are just words. I need to see changes in behavior. What kind of changes? I need you to see me as someone whose judgment you can trust, rather than someone whose decisions need correction. I need you to respect my choices, even when they're different from what you would choose. I need you to treat me like a competent adult, rather than a problem to be managed. I can do that, Mark said. I hope so. Because if you can't, then our relationship is going to remain distant and superficial. I won't tolerate being dismissed or disrespected by my own children, regardless of how much I love you. Mark looked startled by the firmness in my voice. I don't want our relationship to be distant, he said. Then don't make it distant. Treat me with the respect you would show to any other adult whose life choices are different from yours. I will. I promise. I wanted to believe him, but I had heard promises from Mark before. His commitment to change would need to be demonstrated over time through consistent actions rather than declared through momentary words. We'll see, I said. That conversation marked the beginning of a gradual shift in my relationship with all three of my children. Word spread, probably through Mark, that I was wealthier than expected, and I noticed changes in how they all interacted with me. David and Lisa were mostly curious and slightly hurt that I hadn't shared financial information with them earlier, but they accepted my explanations without major drama. Both of them seemed relieved to learn that they didn't need to worry about my financial security in my old age. Mark's adjustment was more complex. He seemed to be genuinely trying to change his behavior, but I could also sense him processing the implications of my wealth for his own life. He never asked directly about inheritance, but I could feel the question lurking beneath many of our conversations. For my part, I found it liberating to stop pretending that money was tight. I made other home improvements that I had been deferring. I bought a newer car to replace my 15-year-old sedan. I hired a cleaning service to help with housework that was becoming physically difficult for me. But I also remained cautious about revealing the full extent of my assets. The gold collection stayed hidden, the safety deposit boxes remained secret, and I continued to live far below my means despite allowing myself more comfort than I had previously enjoyed. 6 months after my kitchen renovation, Mark surprised me with an unexpected proposition. I've been thinking, he said during one of our Sunday dinners. You've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Maybe it's time to do something just for yourself. I looked at him warily. Mark's suggestions about what I should do with my life had been the source of our biggest conflicts. What did you have in mind? Travel. You've never been to Europe, have you? Or taken a cruise? Or seen the national parks out west? You could afford to take amazing trips now. It was true that I had never traveled extensively. Robert and I had always planned to travel after he retired, but his illness had prevented those plans from materializing. Since his death, I had told myself that travel wasn't appealing to someone my age, especially someone traveling alone. But listening to Mark's suggestion, I realized that some of my reluctance to travel had been based on financial anxiety, rather than lack of interest. If I truly didn't need to worry about money, then what was stopping me from exploring the world? Where would you suggest I go? I asked. Mark's face lit up with enthusiasm. Anywhere. You could take a river cruise in Europe, visit the Holy Land, go on an African safari, see the cherry blossoms in Japan. The world is your oyster, Mom. His excitement was contagious, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine possibilities beyond my daily routine of gardening and reading and grocery shopping. Maybe I'll look into some travel options, I said cautiously. I could help you plan something, Mark offered. I know about different cruise lines and tour companies. I was about to accept his offer when something made me pause. Mark's sudden enthusiasm for my travel plans felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. He had previously been enthusiastic about managing my living situation, making decisions about what was best for my lifestyle, correcting choices he viewed as inadequate. Was this another version of the same pattern? Instead of criticizing my decision to stay home, was he now trying to manage my decision about whether and how to travel? I think I'd like to research options myself first, I said, but I appreciate your willingness to help. Mark's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment or frustration, but he nodded agreeably. Of course. Let me know if you want any suggestions. After he left that afternoon, I realized that our relationship was still a work in progress. Mark seemed to have stopped criticizing my lifestyle choices, but he hadn't necessarily stopped trying to influence them. The change felt more tactical than fundamental, but his suggestion about travel had planted a seed. Why wasn't I traveling? Why wasn't I experiencing the world beyond my Chicago neighborhood? If financial security was the point of all my careful saving over the decades, then what was the point of that security if I never used it to enrich my life? That evening, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called a travel agent. I'm interested in taking a trip somewhere I've never been, I told the agent. I'm 78 years old, I'll be traveling alone, and I want it to be special. What type of experience interests you? She asked. Cultural immersion, natural beauty, historical sites, culinary adventures? I thought about the question. What did interest me? What had I always wanted to see or experience? I've always been curious about the Mediterranean, I said. Greece, Italy, the islands, ancient history, beautiful scenery, good food. A Mediterranean cruise might be perfect for you, she suggested. You get to see multiple destinations without the hassle of constantly packing and unpacking. The ships have excellent amenities for solo travelers, and there are shore excursions for every interest level. 2 weeks later, I was booked on a 14-day Mediterranean cruise departing from Rome and visiting ports in Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Spain. It was expensive, more than I had spent on anything besides my house renovations, but I could afford it without financial stress. When I told my children about my travel plans, their reactions were interesting and revealing. David was delighted. Mom, that sounds amazing. You're going to have such a great time. I'm so proud of you for doing something adventurous. Lisa was excited and slightly envious. I've always wanted to go to Greece. You have to promise to take lots of pictures and tell me about everything. Mark was surprised and, I sensed, a little hurt. You decided to book a cruise without asking for my help? I decided I wanted to handle it myself, I said. But thank you for inspiring me to consider travel in the first place. But I could have helped you find better deals, or warned you about cruise line reputations, or... Mark, I interrupted gently, I'm capable of researching and booking my own vacation. I don't need you to manage this for me. I wasn't trying to manage it. I was trying to help, and I appreciate that impulse. But sometimes the best help you can give me is trusting me to handle things myself. Mark looked frustrated, but he didn't argue further. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that his offers of help, however well-intentioned, sometimes felt more like attempts at control. 3 months later, I found myself standing on the deck of a cruise ship, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean Sea. The water was the most beautiful blue I had ever seen, and the warm breeze carried scents of salt and distant islands. I was alone on that deck, but I wasn't lonely. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of adventure and possibility that had nothing to do with my roles as mother, wife, or caregiver. I was simply Edith, a woman experiencing the world's beauty and feeling grateful for the resources that made such experiences possible. The cruise exceeded all my expectations. I visited ancient ruins in Greece, ate fresh pasta in Italian seaside villages, watched traditional dance performances in Turkey, and explored art museums in Barcelona. I talked with fellow passengers from around the world, learned basic phrases in several languages, and discovered that I had more energy and curiosity than I had given myself credit for. Most importantly, I proved to myself that I could navigate travel independently. I managed foreign currencies, found my way around unfamiliar cities, communicated with people who spoke limited English, and handled minor crises like missed connections and lost luggage. I was not the frail, dependent person my children sometimes seem to think I was. When I returned to Chicago, I felt renewed in ways I hadn't expected. The house that had seemed like my entire world now felt like one comfortable corner of a much larger world that I was excited to explore further. My children noticed the change immediately. I had more energy, more confidence, and more to talk about than I'd had in years. David and Lisa were thrilled to hear about my adventures and encouraged me to start planning my next trip. Mark's reaction was more complicated. He seemed genuinely happy that I had enjoyed myself, but also somewhat unsettled by the evidence of my independence and capability. "You look great, Mom," he said during my first post-cruise visit. Really relaxed and happy. "I feel great," I told him. "I'm already planning my next adventure." "What did you have in mind? Maybe a river cruise in Europe next spring? Or possibly a tour of New Zealand? I'm researching options." "These trips must be costing you a fortune." There it was. The concern about money that had become Mark's go-to topic whenever I spent money on anything beyond basic necessities. "They cost what they cost," I said. "I can afford them." "But Mom, you should be careful about depleting your savings. What if you need that money for healthcare or emergencies later?" I looked at my son, still trying to manage my finances and my choices, even after learning that his concerns were based on incorrect assumptions about my resources. "Mark, how much money do you think I have?" He looked uncomfortable. "I don't know. You've never told me." "Guess." "I don't want to guess. I want you to tell me." "Why? Why do you need to know the exact amount?" "Because I want to make sure you're being responsible with your resources. Because I don't want you to run out of money and need help later. Because I'm your son and I care about your financial security." His answer sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying assumptions. He still believed he needed to manage my financial decisions. He still thought his approval was required for my spending choices. "What if I told you that I could take a cruise every month for the rest of my life and still leave substantial inheritances to all three of you?" Mark stared at me. "Is that true? What if it were? How would that change your concerns about my travel expenses?" I guess if you really have that much money, then it wouldn't be a concern." "So your concern wasn't really about my welfare? It was about my spending money you thought was limited." Mark opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. I could see him recognizing the truth in my observation. "I don't know how much money you have," he said finally. "So I don't know what you can afford to spend." I was trying to be cautious. "You are trying to control my spending based on your assumptions about my finances," I corrected, "instead of trusting me to make responsible decisions based on my actual financial situation. So tell me your actual financial situation, or you could trust me to manage my own money without needing to approve my decisions." We were back to the same fundamental issue that had been causing tension between us for months. Mark wanted detailed information about my finances so he could evaluate whether my spending choices were appropriate. I wanted him to respect my autonomy without requiring financial disclosure as a condition of that respect. "I think we need to talk about this more directly," I said. "I think you need to understand something important about our relationship." Mark nodded, perhaps sensing that we were approaching a crucial conversation. "You are my son, and I love you deeply, but you are not my financial advisor, my guardian, or my decision maker. You are not entitled to information about my assets or income unless I choose to share that information. You are not required to approve my spending choices. You are not responsible for protecting me from financial mistakes." But what if you do make mistakes? What if someone tries to scam you, or you get talked into bad investments, or you spend money on things that aren't worth it? Then I'll deal with the consequences of my own mistakes, just like I've been doing for 78 years. That seems risky. Life is risky. But the alternative, having my adult children monitor and manage my decisions, is more risky to my dignity and autonomy than any financial mistake I might make. Mark was quiet for a long moment. "I'm scared," he said finally. His honesty surprised me. "Scared of what?" "Scared that you'll make decisions I don't understand. Scared that you'll spend money on things that don't seem important. Scared that you'll get taken advantage of by people who want your money. Scared that you'll change in ways I'm not prepared for." "And you think knowing details about my finances would make you feel less scared?" "Maybe. If I understood your resources, I might worry less about your choices. Or you might worry more. You might start seeing every purchase as money that won't be available for your inheritance. You might start having opinions about what I should and shouldn't buy. You might start treating me like an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Is that what you think of me? That I only care about inheritance?" I considered his question carefully. "I think you're human. I think even good people can start behaving differently when they know someone has substantial wealth. I think money changes relationships in ways that aren't always positive. So you don't trust me." "I trust you to be human," I repeated. which means I trust that you would try to behave well with information about my wealth, but I also recognize that such information might influence your behavior in ways you don't intend or expect. Mark looked hurt, but he also seemed to be considering my words seriously. What would it take for you to trust me with that information? Time. Evidence that you can respect my autonomy without needing to understand or approve my choices. Evidence that you can see me as a competent adult rather than someone who needs guidance and protection. How long? I don't know. As long as it takes. And what if I never earn that trust? What if you never tell me about your finances? Then you'll learn about them when I die, through my will and estate. Mark winced. That seems like a terrible way to handle things. It seems like a necessary way to handle things, given the dynamics in our relationship. What dynamics? Your need to control and manage my life. Your tendency to substitute your judgment for mine. Your assumption that your concerns about my choices are more valid than my own assessment of those choices. We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see Mark processing what I had said, trying to reconcile my perception of his behavior with his own intentions. I don't want to control your life, he said finally. I want to help you and protect you. Those impulses can look very similar from the receiving end. Help that I don't ask for can feel like interference. Protection I don't need can feel like condescension. So what do you want from me? I want you to see me as I actually am rather than as you think I should be. I want you to trust my judgment even when my choices are different from what you would choose. I want you to respect my privacy and my autonomy. I want you to offer support when I ask for it, but not impose support when I don't. And if I can do those things, you'll share more information about your finances? If you can do those things, our relationship will be healthier regardless of what financial information I choose to share. Mark nodded slowly. I think I understand. You're saying the problem isn't really about money. It's about respect. Exactly. The money is just the most obvious area where respect issues play out. But the same dynamics show up in other areas too. My living situation, my lifestyle choices, my travel decisions. I see that now. And I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was being disrespectful. I believe you didn't realize it. But impact matters more than intention. Even well-intentioned interference can be harmful. So, how do we fix this? You start treating me like the competent adult I am. You stop offering unsolicited advice about my choices. You ask questions out of genuine interest rather than concern or judgment. You trust me to know my own mind and manage my own affairs. That sounds simple, but I think it might be harder than it sounds. Probably. Changing relationship patterns that have developed over years usually is hard, but it's necessary if you want our relationship to be close and genuine rather than distant and superficial. Mark was quiet for a moment. I do want our relationship to be close. You're my mother, and I love you. I don't want there to be this tension between us all the time. Then you know what you need to do. Over the following months, I watched Mark struggle to implement the changes we had discussed. Some days were better than others. He would catch himself starting to offer unsolicited advice and stop mid-sentence. He would ask about my activities with genuine curiosity rather than veiled concern. He would express interest in my travel plans without trying to manage the details. But old habits are stubborn, and I could see him fighting internal battles between his desire to respect my autonomy and his urge to guide my decisions. The real test came when I announced my next major decision. I had been thinking for months about making my wealth work for causes I cared about. My secret gold collection had grown beyond any reasonable need for personal financial security, and I was beginning to see it as a resource that could benefit others rather than just an insurance policy for myself. I decided to establish a foundation focused on supporting elderly people who were struggling financially. Having spent years hiding my own wealth, I had become acutely aware of older adults in my community who were facing genuine hardship. I wanted to help them with housing costs, medical expenses, and other essentials that would allow them to maintain dignity and independence in their later years. The foundation would require a substantial initial donation, several $1,000,000 to be effective. It would also require ongoing management and oversight. It would make my wealth more visible in the community, though I planned to maintain privacy about the full extent of my resources. When I told my children about my plans, their reactions were illuminating. David was immediately supportive. Mom, that's an incredible way to use your resources. You could make such a difference in people's lives. Lisa was excited and wanted to help with the foundation's marketing and outreach efforts. This is exactly the kind of work that matters, especially now when so many older people are struggling. Mark was complicated. That's a very generous impulse, Mom, he said carefully. But have you thought through all the implications? What implications? Well, once you give money to a foundation, it's gone. You can't get it back if you need it later. And foundations have a lot of administrative overhead. You might be able to help more people by just giving money directly to individuals who need it. I could hear the barely concealed anxiety in his voice. Mark was worried that my charitable giving would reduce his eventual inheritance, but he was trying to frame his concerns as practical advice about effective philanthropy. I've already researched foundation management, I said. I understand the costs and benefits. But Mom, are you sure you can afford to give away millions of dollars? There it was. The direct question about the extent of my wealth, phrased as concern about my financial security. I'm sure, I said simply. How can you be sure without telling us how much you actually have? Because I know how much I actually have, and I know how much is more than enough for my remaining lifetime needs. Mark looked frustrated. It just seems like you're making major financial decisions without input from people who care about you. I'm making decisions about my own money based on my own values and priorities. That's what competent adults do. But what if you're wrong? What if you underestimate your future expenses? Or live longer than expected? Or need expensive medical care? What if giving away this money means you can't help us if we have emergencies? His last question revealed another layer of his concern. Mark wasn't just worried about his inheritance. He was worried about losing access to my resources as a safety net for his own financial struggles. Mark, I said gently, I want you to think carefully about what you're saying. You're suggesting that I shouldn't donate money to charity because I might need to give that money to you instead. That's not... I just want to make sure you're thinking through all the possibilities. I am thinking through the possibilities, including the possibility that my adult son needs to develop financial independence rather than relying on his mother as a permanent backup plan. Mark looked stung. That's not fair. I haven't asked you for money in months. That's true, and I appreciate that. But your concern about my charitable giving suggests you still view my money as potentially your money. You're worried that my generosity to others will reduce my availability to you. Maybe that's part of it, Mark admitted. Is that so wrong? You're my mother. Isn't it natural for me to hope that your resources might be available if I really need them? His honesty was refreshing, but his assumption was troubling. It's natural, I agreed, but it's not healthy. For you or for me? What do you mean? I mean that as long as you see me as a potential source of financial rescue, you have less incentive to develop your own financial stability. And as long as you view my money as partially yours, you feel entitled to have opinions about how I spend it. Mark was quiet, processing this observation. I want you to succeed on your own merits, I continued. I want you to build financial security through your own efforts, rather than through dependence on your inheritance. I want you to be proud of what you accomplish, rather than waiting for what you might receive. But what if I can't? What if I'm never successful at business or career? What if I always struggle financially? Then you'll live with the consequences of your choices, just like every other adult. You'll find ways to manage on whatever income you earn. You'll make decisions about what you can and can't afford. You'll develop resilience and resourcefulness. That's easy for you to say. You have millions of dollars. I have millions of dollars because I made choices over decades that prioritized saving and investing over spending and consuming. I lived below my means, worked hard, and made careful financial decisions. Those choices were available to you too. But I didn't know you were wealthy. I didn't have a role model for building wealth. You didn't need to know I was wealthy to learn principles like spending less than you earn, avoiding debt, saving for emergencies, and investing for the future. Those principles are available to anyone. Mark looked defeated. I guess I messed up my finances too badly to fix them now. You're 46 years old. If you started making better financial choices today, you could still build significant wealth over the next 20 years. But only if you stop waiting for external rescue and start taking responsibility for your own situation. And you won't help me get started? I've been helping you get started for 20 years. At some point, helping becomes enabling, and enabling becomes harmful. We sat in silence while Mark absorbed this difficult truth. So you're really going to give millions of dollars to strangers instead of your own family? His question revealed that he still didn't fully understand my position. I'm going to use my resources in ways that align with my values, I said. My values include helping people in need, but they also include encouraging independence and self-sufficiency in my own family. What if we need help? If you have genuine emergencies that you can't handle on your own, we can discuss those situations individually. But I'm not going to provide ongoing financial support for lifestyle choices or poor planning. How do you decide what counts as a genuine emergency? The same way any reasonable person would. Medical crises, natural disasters, job loss due to economic conditions beyond your control, those are legitimate emergencies. Business failures due to poor planning, overspending on lifestyle choices, inability to find work because you're being too selective, those aren't emergencies? Mark nodded reluctantly. I think I understand. Do you? Do you really understand that my money is mine to allocate according to my own priorities? and that your potential inheritance is a gift rather than an entitlement? I'm trying to understand it. It's hard to give up the security of knowing you're there as a backup plan. I know it's hard, but holding on to that security is preventing you from developing real security based on your own capabilities. And you think giving away millions to charity will help me develop those capabilities? I think it will remove the temptation to rely on my money instead of your own efforts. And I think it will demonstrate that I'm serious about the values I'm trying to teach you. Mark was quiet for a long moment. I'm proud of you, he said finally. I don't like it, but I'm proud of you. His conflicted response felt honest and appropriate. Change is difficult, especially when it involves giving up something you've been counting on. Thank you, I said. Your pride in my choices matters to me more than your agreement with them. 6 months later, I officially launched the Edith Morrison Foundation for Elderly Support. The initial donation was $5 million, a substantial amount that established the foundation as a significant player in local charitable work, but still only a fraction of my total wealth. The community response was overwhelming. Local media covered the foundation's launch, and I received hundreds of applications for assistance within the first month. Working with professional staff, we were able to help elderly residents with rent payments, medical bills, home modifications for accessibility, and other needs that made the difference between dignity and desperation in their later years. For the first time in my life, I felt the satisfaction of using my wealth for purposes beyond my family's needs. The foundation gave my money meaning beyond mere accumulation, and it gave me a role beyond mother and widow. My children's adjustments to this new version of me continued to evolve. David and Lisa remained supportive and eventually became involved in foundation activities. Lisa used her design skills to create marketing materials, and David provided advice about environmental considerations for our grant-making. Mark's adjustment was slower and more difficult. He struggled with what he perceived as unfairness. Why should strangers benefit from my money when my own son still faced financial challenges? But gradually, as months passed without financial crisis or requests for help, he began to develop more confidence in his own abilities. He found steady work as a financial consultant, helping small businesses with bookkeeping and tax preparation. The income was modest but reliable, and he seemed to find satisfaction in building expertise rather than chasing dramatic success. More importantly, he stopped asking about my finances. He stopped offering unsolicited advice about my spending. He stopped trying to manage my decisions or evaluate my choices. Our relationship became more relaxed and genuine than it had been in years. We could have conversations about topics other than his financial needs or my lifestyle choices. We could enjoy each other's company without underlying tension about money or control. 1 year after launching the foundation, Mark surprised me with an unexpected comment during one of our Sunday dinners. I've been thinking about what you said about developing my own financial security instead of counting on inheritance, he said. Oh? I opened a retirement account last month. It's just a small amount right now, but I'm going to start contributing regularly. I felt a surge of pride and relief. That's wonderful, Mark. I also paid off my credit card debt. All of it. For the first time in maybe 15 years, I don't owe money on my cards. How does that feel? Scary and good at the same time. Scary because I don't have that credit available if I need it. Good because I'm not paying interest every month. The scary part will pass. The good part will get stronger. Mark smiled. I hope so. I'm starting to understand what you meant about security that comes from your own choices versus security that depends on other people. It's a different kind of security, but it's more reliable in the long run. I think you're right. And Mom? Yes? I don't need to know how much money you have. I mean, I'm still curious, but I don't need to know. I trust you to make good decisions about your resources. His words were among the most meaningful I had heard from any of my children in years. Thank you, I said. That means everything to me. I should have trusted you all along. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out. You figured it out eventually. That's what matters. As we finished dinner that evening, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life for years. My relationship with Mark had finally evolved from one of dependence and control to one of mutual respect and genuine affection. But there was still one more surprise waiting for all of us. 3 months later, while working in my garden on a warm spring afternoon, I made a decision that even I hadn't expected. I was planting new roses in the bed where Robert's original bushes had once grown, when my shovel struck something hard beneath the soil. For a moment, I thought it was just a large rock. But as I dug around it, I realized it was one of my buried containers of gold coins. This particular container held coins I had purchased in the 1990s, when gold was significantly less expensive than its current price. The 20 coins in this small waterproof box were now worth approximately $40,000. I sat back on my heels, holding the heavy container in my soil-stained hands, and thought about the dozens of similar containers buried throughout my property. I thought about the coins hidden in my house, the bars stored in multiple safety deposit boxes, the assets I had accumulated and secreted away over 4 decades. For the first time, the secrecy felt more burdensome than protective. I thought about my children, who were now all building independent, responsible lives. Mark was establishing financial stability through his own efforts. David and Lisa had always been financially self-sufficient. None of them were asking me for money or trying to manage my choices. I thought about my foundation, which was helping dozens of elderly people in my community, but could help hundreds more with additional resources. I thought about myself, 79 years old now, with more wealth than I could possibly spend in my remaining lifetime. What was the point of keeping secrets that no longer served any useful purpose? That evening, I called each of my children and invited them to dinner the following Sunday. I have something important I want to discuss with all of you, I told them. Is everything okay, Mom? Lisa asked, her voice concerned. Everything is fine, I assured her. Better than fine. I just have some information I'm ready to share. Sunday dinner became a family reunion of sorts. David flew in from Montana, Lisa drove up from her home in the suburbs, and Mark arrived with flowers from the farmer's market. The mood was festive and curious. After we finished eating, I asked them all to join me in the living room. I had prepared a simple presentation, copies of recent financial statements showing the current value of my various investments and accounts. For 40 years, I began, I've been keeping a secret about our family's financial situation. I kept this secret because I wanted you all to develop independence and work ethic without being influenced by expectations about inheritance. I wanted your relationships with me to be based on love and respect, rather than financial considerations. I handed each of them a folder containing the financial documents. But I think you've all grown into adults who can handle this information responsibly. And I think I'm ready to stop carrying this secret alone. My children opened their folders and read in silence for several minutes. I watched their faces change as they processed the numbers on the pages. Mom, David said finally, this says you have $12.5 million. I finished. Approximately. The exact amount fluctuates with market conditions. $12.5 million. Lisa repeated faintly. How is that possible? I spent the next hour explaining my years of careful saving, my investments in gold when prices were much lower, my decision to live below my means and accumulate assets rather than spending them. So when Mark was asking you for money all those years, David said, I was giving him money I could easily afford, but I was also enabling behavior that wasn't healthy for him in the long run. Mark, who had been unusually quiet during my explanation, finally spoke up. I feel like an idiot. Why? Because I spent so much time worrying about your finances when you were wealthy the entire time. Because I criticized your lifestyle choices when they were actually preferences rather than limitations. Because I treated you like someone who needed my guidance when you were more financially sophisticated than I was. You weren't an idiot, I said gently. You were responding to incomplete information in ways that seemed reasonable based on what you knew. But I should have trusted you more. I should have respected your autonomy instead of trying to manage your decisions. You learn to do those things eventually. That's what matters. Lisa was still staring at the financial statements. So the foundation donation was just a small portion of your total wealth. About 40%, I confirmed. I could afford to be generous with charity because I still had more than enough left for any possible personal need. And our inheritances will still be… David hesitated to finish the question. Substantial, I said. Assuming I don't live to be 150 years old and need decades of expensive medical care. My children sat in stunned silence, absorbing the implications of what they had learned. I have a proposal, I said. Now that you know the truth about my financial situation, I want to make some changes to how we handle family finances. What kind of changes? Mark asked. First, I want to increase my foundation donation to $8 million. That will still leave me with more than enough for my lifetime needs. Plus, it will allow the foundation to help significantly more people. My children nodded, though Lisa looked slightly dazed. Second, I want to give each of you $1 million now, while I'm alive to see you benefit from it. This announcement generated more dramatic responses. David's eyes widened. Lisa actually gasped. Mark looked like he might faint. You don't have to accept the gifts if you don't want them, I continued. But I've reached the point in my life where I have more money than I need, and I'd like to share some of it with my children while I can enjoy watching you use it. Mom, Mark said, I don't know if I should accept that money. I'm finally learning to be financially independent. Won't $1 million undermine that progress? His question showed how much he had grown over the past 2 years. The Mark who had previously asked for $1,500 for rent was now questioning whether he should accept $1 million. That's your decision to make, I said. But I don't think money itself undermines independence. I think dependence on money from other people undermines independence. If you accept this gift, it would be yours to manage however you choose, with no strings attached and no expectations from me. I could invest it and live off the returns, Mark mused. That would give me financial security without making me dependent on you for ongoing support. You could do that. Or you could use it to start a business, or travel, or buy a house, or donate it to charity, or anything else you wanted. It would be your money. David was shaking his head in amazement. I can't believe you've been walking around with this secret for 40 years. It wasn't easy, I admitted, especially during the years when you were all struggling and I wanted to help, but was afraid that too much help would be harmful. Do you think it was the right decision? Lisa asked, keeping it secret for so long. I think it was necessary at the time, but I'm glad I don't have to keep it secret anymore. It feels good to be completely honest with you about who I am and what resources I have. Over the following weeks, my children each made their decisions about the monetary gifts I had offered. David accepted his $1 million and immediately invested most of it in retirement accounts and college funds for his future children. Lisa used her money to pay off her mortgage and start a small design business. Mark put his entire gift into conservative investments and planned to live off the returns while continuing to work and build his consulting practice. All three of them handled their newfound wealth with the maturity and wisdom I had hoped to see from them. None of them quit working or made dramatically irresponsible purchases. None of them started treating me differently or making assumptions about additional gifts. The foundation expansion allowed us to help 3 times as many elderly residents in our community. I became more involved in the organization's daily operations, finding purpose and satisfaction in work that felt meaningful after years of retirement. My house, my garden, my quiet lifestyle, all the things Mark had once criticized as inadequate, became sources of contentment rather than apology. I knew now that my children saw these choices as preferences rather than limitations, as expressions of my values rather than evidence of my constraints. Most importantly, my relationships with my children evolved into genuine adult friendships based on mutual respect, rather than financial dependence or parental authority. Looking back now, from my kitchen table where this whole story began, I can see how every choice I made over the decades contributed to this outcome. The years of secret saving created the wealth that gave me options. The years of keeping that wealth hidden allowed my children to develop character and independence. The gradual revelation of my financial position allowed our relationships to mature into something healthier and more honest. Mark still visits every Sunday, but now he brings stories about his clients and questions about investment strategies rather than requests for money or criticism of my choices. We cook together, work in the garden together, and sometimes just sit on the porch talking about books we've read or places we'd like to visit. He has never again called my house a dump. He has never again suggested that my life is too small or sad. He sees me now as I actually am, a capable, independent woman who has chosen a lifestyle that brings her joy and peace. The gold that started this whole journey is gone now, converted into foundation donations and family gifts and investments that will benefit others long after I'm gone. But the security it provided, not just financial security, but the security of knowing I could take care of myself and my family, that security remains. I am no longer the woman who sat alone in her kitchen, hurt by her son's casual contempt, and wondering if her life had any value beyond the money she could provide to others. I am a woman who knows her worth, who has seen her impact on the world, who has loving relationships with her children based on respect rather than need. The house where Mark once said I was just existing has become a home where I am truly living. And that, more than any amount of gold or money, is the real treasure I discovered along the way. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where keeping secrets from your family created distance even when you thought you were protecting them? Have you watched a loved one struggle to see your true worth because they were focused on their assumptions about your limitations? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is reveal our authentic selves, even when we're afraid of how others might react. I'd love to hear your thoughts about family dynamics, financial secrets, and the courage it takes to demand respect from those we love most. Please share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your life who deserves more respect than they're receiving, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. These stories matter, and sharing them helps us all feel less alone in our struggles and triumphs.